right, well, welcome to the State of Tech Enablement. So let's get started slowly. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Marko. I'll be sharing today just a number of stories of things that we've seen going on in the industry from at least our vantage point, and and how that relates to tech enablement. So as a background, a lot of these stories come from the community that we help manage, called Technocon. And Tomomi, that's on the call here, she's been instrumental in organizing it and managing it. And so through that community, we get many companies, your peers, sharing how they're tackling various aspects of tech enablement. So that's what we're going to be taking a peek at. So with that, what do we mean by tech enablement? Generally speaking, it's the big promise is that we want to enable our technical folks to be able to do their best work. So how do we go about that, and what does that mean? So we basically put an umbrella over a number of initiatives that companies typically have, such as technical onboarding, knowledge sharing, peer learning, mentorship, office hours, technical documentation, etc. There's a slew of things that go into enabling people to have the right skills, and so we kind of put an umbrella around that and call it tech enablement. So what's the challenge here? Well, usually when you start as a small organization, everyone knows everyone, or a small team. Everyone's sort of like knows everyone. The communication networks are relatively short, and people get to the right information and right knowledge very quickly. The challenge happens when you start scaling, because as you scale, the number of connections between humans, people on the team or an organization, starts growing exponentially or quadratically, and so that's what leads to the actual challenges of knowledge sharing. So one of the things that we see is that often you have lack of organizational knowledge sharing. So what happens usually is people join a team and not an organization per se. So what that means is that a lot of responsibility for how onboarding happens, how knowledge sharing happens, is at the team level. And that essentially then creates silos. And we hear often people saying, well, everything's great on my team, but it's that other team that we have a challenge with. And that usually arises because there's no sort of glue that's connecting, the fabric that's connecting multiple teams together into an organization. And ultimately, that means that the organization is not nimble. So what we want is, again, we want high performance at scale. As we mentioned before, as we scale, we add people, and that adds complexities of communication, and that manifests itself as an organizational drag. Essentially becomes just like a technical debt becomes a debt on the organization and how it works. So what I'll be doing is I'll be sharing some stories from companies that many of you probably can relate to and know, and how they experience this. So I'll start with, so this is a story of Facebook when they were much smaller. There are about 300 people at this point. And Wayne Chang was one of the original engineering managers. And he basically made an argument that even at that size, Facebook needs to start worrying about how to get everyone on the same page. So not just run fast and break things, but run fast and provide some kind of guardrails so that we break fewer things, and that everyone's on the same page. So he invested early on in engineering bootcamp, and arguably it's one of the best bootcamps in the industry. And what's also interesting about Facebook is that when you join Facebook engineering, you're not joining a team right away. So remember, we mentioned earlier how in some cases you get a siloed experience. You end up on a team, and so everything's great on a team, but like you don't have a lot of sensibility to other teams because there's a lack of understanding of who's doing what. So Facebook addresses that by having you join engineering first. So they basically hold back their engineers for a while before they hand them over to the team. And a while can be anywhere between 4 and 6 weeks. So that's kind of unique and different for them and how they approach that. The other story of scale is the one that we're familiar with because we were part of Twitter at that point in time. But essentially, Twitter was doubling just pre-IPO, and as they were adding engineers, they were experiencing a lot of issues with organizational drag. So basically, it became obvious that adding more bodies does not make us faster. And so Alex Rudder, who was running engineering at the time, his whole thing was, well, we can add more people, or we can make existing people more effective. So like if we can improve the effectiveness of the team or organization by 10%, that's equivalent to adding 100 people to the team. So he focused on effectiveness versus just increasing the headcount. So this is now Twitter at about 1,000 engineers, so slightly bigger than Facebook at the time. So one of the things that we kind of think about is the maturity level of tech enablement. So we created something called TEMI, Tech Enablement Maturity Index, and it sort of has these 5 steps. And I'll be talking about these 5 steps as we kind of go through this. But as I kind of do this, think about where you find your organization to be right now. So level 1, sink or swim. Level 2, there's a hero that owns it. Level 3, there's a partial ownership. 4, complete ownership, and then finally there's a well-funded team. So think about like where you fit organizationally in terms of tech enablement maturity. So sink or swim. So usually it starts by not doing anything. So basically a new hire joins and you hand them a laptop, you show them how the benefits, sort of HR stuff, how the benefits work, and hopefully how to log into key systems. And that's about it. So it's really up to them from there on to figure out how things are organized. This can happen at smaller companies, but it can also happen at larger companies. So we worked with WeWork, and they were at about 800 engineers at the time, and they were going to double. This is before they sort of downsized. But they were going to double. And at that time, even at 800 engineers, they literally would just hand you a laptop and show you where the bathrooms are. And that was about it. Like there was no clear way, even where to get a code base or who to talk to or how things work. Like there was a very, very little organized sort of onboarding or any sort of enablement going on for their engineers. So that was a problem that they were trying to solve. GitHub, even to this date, as far as I know, they trust their engineers, their managers to do everything. So it's more up to the managers versus at the organizational level. And so that causes that, what we talked about earlier, that siloed experience where every team is on their own. So that's level 1, sink or swim. Level 2, what usually happens is somebody had enough, and so they basically raise their hand, usually an engineer, individual contributor, and says, okay, I'm going to do something about this. This is not working for us and it's becoming a drag. So usually it's a volunteer that steps in. The challenge with this is that it being not funded, it's usually not scalable. So it ends up being somebody's 120% time, right? So that's the challenge with just having a volunteer. We see this happen all the time. So when we joined Twitter, for example, there was a person that started a flight school, which was run this way. That was the onboarding program for Twitter engineering at the time, and it was his part-time job. We've seen this early on with Carbon Health as well. I'll be talking about them shortly. But initially, there was an engineer, and she stepped in and said, hey, we need to do something about this, and eventually ended up funding it. So speaking of funding it, so at some point, leadership usually gets that there's a challenge and that somebody needs to own this, and then they do something about that. They dedicate a head count or nominate usually a TPM or something like that to technical program manager to basically own it. So I mentioned Carbon Health earlier. They went through a similar experience. They were scaling from 5 to 90 engineers in under a year. So very rapid growth. And it started with a volunteer, and then she got a program manager to help her out, and that eventually became a team that started owning that concern. So that's kind of their story of rapid scaling and basically paying down their tech enablement debt. We've seen this at Carta as well. So Carta is still experiencing that rapid growth, and they started. They nominated the TPM to own it, and so he basically took that on. So level 4 usually means there's a full ownership. So there's usually a person that now has a full-time job managing this, and by managing it, that usually means that they're creating some kind of a program. So we're starting to get something that's deliberate and organized. It's totally a next level experience for new hires, for existing team, etc. A couple of stories here. So Spotify noticed the need for to basically share knowledge, and they came up with a concept. They call it collaborative learning, and to them this was a way to unlock innovation. So they basically funded a program to be deliberate about their collaborative peer learning, so that they can innovate faster, so that knowledge flows freely, and through that they can clue everyone in and basically learn from one another. Kia Motors is an interesting example because they're not what we would consider a typical tech company. However, they got inspired by Airbnb, and they heard how Airbnb is doing peer learning, and so they said, "Hey, like this is kind of cool. Let's try to democratize it." And so they launched their peer learning program and unlocked that democratized learning for their entire team. So that's a story of Kia. Another car company, so Cruise, they funded it, and they have a dedicated person that owns the learning, and what they're doing is they're deliberately enabling internal subject matter experts to stand up and deliver in classes internally. Credit Karma is also another example. They were much smaller, but they had when they were smaller, they had a person that owned it. So Nazim basically owned that, and she set up to create a peer learning program, and through that enable that collaborative learning. So that's a level 4. And then finally, we have level 5, where it goes beyond just a single person. And usually there's an entire team that owns this. So typically we see this at larger companies, which kind of makes sense. So speaking of larger companies, so one example that whenever I think scale, I always think about Microsoft. They onboard 1,200 engineers per month. Okay, so most companies don't even have that many engineers, and this is how many they add monthly. I think they're at about 100,000 engineers today. So that's the next level of scale when it comes to how they manage this. So there's an entire team of teams that's responsible for doing this behind the scenes. Salesforce is a little more nimble, although they also have a large scale, about 18,000 engineers. And what they do is they have a team. It's actually one person that ends up managing a lot of their internal learning. She does that through partnership with other training companies. So this is a slightly different approach, because it's not so much based on just internal learning, but it's actually being augmented by bringing experts from outside of the building in to teach classes. So Mariko manages that there. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Netflix has an entire team, so and actually they have multiple teams. So they have in this particular case, this is the engineering education, so developer education. They also have a team that's responsible for studio, etc., and very deliberate about that approach and how they do it. And then finally, Twitter is where we kind of learned the ropes. So Twitter University was how Twitter addressed their internal learning with a dedicated team. It was actually the team that we came from. Sort of leapfrogged a number of levels. So this is an example where a single, these levels don't need to be followed one by one. So Twitter was actually behind when it came to partial ownership. So they basically just had a volunteer running it, and then they leapfrogged that into a fully funded team, which is an interesting example of how that worked out. So, so those are the various levels of maturity. Now, how do we go about this maturity? How do we get to to enable our teams? Like, what are the building blocks? So we're going to talk about a number of various things. Before we do that, I just kind of want to kind of have you think about this journey of a new hire to somebody who's fully able to do their best work at a company, right? So a new hire usually comes in, there's some sort of automation, something that gets them into, all right, well, you need to now learn and, be indoctrinated in the way. And then there's usually some kind of codified knowledge. This could be wiki, this could be Google Docs, it could be also learning, so instructor-led training, LMS content, etc. But this is usually the knowledge that somebody needs to acquire. Then there's a matter of practice, right? So internalizing that knowledge and getting to own it. And that could be in forms of workshops, it could be quizzes, it could be hands-on experience, and so on. Now, ultimately, usually people get stuck, so not everything works perfect, right? And they need support. So support could be in the form of mentorship, coaching, office hours, etc. At some point, we want to verify that new hires have the required knowledge. And so that could be in a form of assessments and surveys, code labs, various things, things like that. Anything that you can basically demonstrate that you know what you learned. And finally, there's some kind of a feedback loop. So how do we know that this is working, that the program is working, right? So what are the participants telling us? Are they acquiring the required knowledge and internalizing it? So if we kind of think about this journey, there are different things that we can do to mature in these processes. So we'll I'll talk a little bit about onboarding, because this is usually the initial low-hanging fruit. So onboarding is one such journey where you go from joining the company to being fully enabled. And the point here is to compress it, to make it as short as possible so that people get up to speed quickly, but also do it in a way that is a great experience for a new hire, right? And so what we just mentioned earlier was about thinking holistically. So basically thinking in terms of like, well, there's some instructions, there's some sort of practice, and there's some sort of support. So all these pieces are usually needed for successful onboarding. So a couple of example stories to share. One is LinkedIn. So this is a story of LinkedIn going through the COVID and remote first experience. So essentially, they used to have a bootcamp, engineering bootcamp, which was in person. It happened in Sunnyvale, so people would either fly in town and take a training, and then everything moved online. And so they basically within a couple of days reconfigured their entire program to be online. And a couple of key points in this story are that it wasn't just moving an in-person course online. There was much more to that. They had to figure out what makes sense to move online. They had to figure out what the right tools are. for that, what the right modalities are, and also to figure out who's going to be delivering it and how they're going to be delivering given the time zones and differences like that. So but they ultimately did it, and they were proud of how it panned out, how it worked out for them. So that's the story of LinkedIn going through the pandemic. Uber had a similar experience where they had to move online quickly. However, the difference with Uber is that they wanted to give, to maintain some global context, but they also wanted to give local teams their own autonomy, right? Because Uber is different based on a geography, and there's slight differences, and there's localized innovation and experimentation and so on. So this is an example where the mothership, if you will, controls a large part of the engineering onboarding, but also enables the local teams to contribute to that and make it their own experience. So Carbon Health, we talked about that and how they rapidly scaled and how they went through all the steps of tech enablement maturity. So that's onboarding as one of the low-hanging fruits. The next one that we have is peer and collaborative learning. So the premise here is that often the most important knowledge is the knowledge that's right in the building, that's within the team. And that's the knowledge we're focused on sharing. And so how do different companies tackle this? So we talked about Twitter University originally. So Spotify also mentioned. Netflix Studios is an interesting example. They during the pandemic moved to mostly online experience. So they basically said, what people are looking for now is asynchronous learning. So they basically shifted from in-person to asynchronous, only to discover that that's actually causing them to lose the human touch. So people were feeling less connected to one another, and so they were missing the social bonds, and this was negatively impacting their culture. And Netflix cares about the culture a lot, so they basically had a pendulum swing the other way and bring in some more live components to their onboarding as well. So that's the Netflix Studios in their blended learning approach. And this is another story of LinkedIn. It's a different story. It's about how they do their tech talks. So one of the things that started grassroots at LinkedIn Engineering is tech talks. And so basically it was started by one engineer and it worked really well. And so he started adding more and more to that, and it became a very prominent sort of grassroots program. And so they basically then turned around and bottled it and operationalized it so that they have literally hundreds of tech talks happening at all times, and so scaled it up. So that's a little bit about peer learning as one of the tools in the toolbox to enable knowledge sharing internally. Documentation is often a big promise. It's something that everyone believes in, and everyone thinks that it's going to be the silver bullet to knowledge sharing, and it is an important component. It by itself is not sufficient, probably, because the underlying thing that we document often changes. But a couple of things that we are seeing as best practices is institutionalizing that culture of documentation. So basically, making people aware that documenting their work is just as important. So that's a first step. The second step is figuring out how people are going to be discovering, how engineers are going to be discovering the documentation. Where's that going to live? Right, so that searchability, discoverability is often a problem, and it's one thing to be documenting; it's another thing to be finding things that are authoritative. What we've seen at Twitter and Atlassian and companies like that have massive wiki installations is that the problem is not having documentation. The problem is figuring out which documentation is authoritative. One of the reasons why things are not necessarily authoritative is that the documentation starts drifting from what it's documenting, right? So managing that is often a challenge, and it's even bigger challenge if the documentation and say code are disconnected, right? So for example, if we're documenting the code in Wiki, the two systems tend to be far away from one another, and basically that means that there's no guardrails to prevent a drift other than engineers remembering to update the docs. So that's one challenge. There's some ways to mitigate this by co-locating, for example, documentation with code whenever possible, and then instrumenting that so the drift is something that we can measure automatically. Another thing that we see is ownership. So not having clear ownership, having docs that are out of date, having multiple people comment on or document how to do a best practice differently, and they might be just as authoritative. So the question is then who owns what? And there are different answers to this. Certain things can be owned by the team. That's, for example, documenting their own project. Certain things could be owned by a documentation organization, right? That would own sort of bigger best practices and things of that nature that span across multiple teams. And another thing to think about is the types of docs. There are docs that are guides, there are docs that are API documentation, project documentation, etc. So different docs will have different policies on how to best do them. So on the other side of the spectrum of the documentation, which is asynchronous and self-paced, and you do it on your own, is mentorship, coaching, and office hours. So this is more of a one-on-one experience, ad hoc experience. And it's usually a tool that's useful for when people are stuck, right? So for example, if I'm being onboarded, I might have read all the docs, I might have taken all the boot camps, and when push comes to shove, when I'm actually doing the work, I can get stuck. And so how do I get unstuck? Like, what's the way to get unstuck? And which doors do I knock on, right? So there are different ways of this one-on-one ad hoc sort of experiences. On one hand, we see buddy system. That's usually useful for onboarding. So a new hire is paired with a buddy. On the other side of the spectrum, we see career mentors. So I might have been at the company for a while, but now I'm looking for somebody to help me get to the next level. There could be professional coaching. So maybe I'm working on a specific project, or maybe I'm a new manager and I have a specific issue. So it's very situational in nature, for example. And then there could be office hours. I'm just stuck with something, so I just want to knock at somebody's door and get help around that. So having a team have their office hours be known and accessible, and basically have a way to interact with the team and ask those questions. So a couple of examples of this. So Airbnb a couple of years ago said, hey, mentorship is important to us. Now we're talking about career mentorship. And they basically created a program where they enabled their people, and when I say people, everyone in the company, so it was about 6,000 employees at the time, to become mentors. And so what that meant is that they would go through a lightweight training. So there was a 4-hour session. And once you complete that session, you're quote unquote certified as a mentor. You create your profile, and then other employees can tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, I would like to create a mentorship relationship with you. And so within the first year, they had about 10% of the population of the employees become mentors. So it became a truly democratized peer mentorship program that they launched and scaled. Slightly different approach is Shopify. So Shopify, it started with the CEO. So Toby basically had his own executive coach, and it worked really well for him. And then he said, well, if it's working for me, why don't I bring it to my executive team? So he brought this executive coach to his team and worked great for them. And so then they figured out, well, why don't we just enable it for the entire company? And it was about 5,000 employees at the time. So they went out and they basically recruited about a dozen professional coaches and brought them in, put them on a payroll, and made them available to everyone in a company who has a coaching need. So basically, any employee can log in and say, hey, I'm looking for an hour, half an hour session, and you get paired with a professional coach to help you out with whatever it is that you're dealing with. So unlike Airbnb where it's peer run, this is professionally managed. Dropbox is also experimenting with something. So they're on this journey to democratize their coaching. So, and when I say democratize, they're looking to go beyond just the upper echelon of the executives. So they wanted to basically enable everyone in the company. And unlike Airbnb, they just went and did it. Dropbox took a little bit more of a deliberate path of like, okay, we're gonna try this and then we're gonna try that and eventually we'll get there. So this is their journey that's still unfolding. Group mentorship at Autodesk is another example that's slightly different type of coaching. What Autodesk wanted to do is enable their managers to be better managers. And so to do that, they created forums, essentially peer groups of people that can come together and share and discuss topics that are top of mind for them. And sometimes those peer groups were self-managed by engineering managers. Sometimes they were basically moderated by somebody that volunteered. Again, it's all internal, but the focus was on their engineering managers. So that's mentorship, coaching, and office hours as an approach, as a tool in the toolbox to enable that one-on-one ad hoc sort of connection for various needs, right? So from onboarding to career mentorship to office to situational professional coaching and office hours when you're stuck. Another tool is external expertise. So what we see certain companies bring in not just knowledge from inside the building, but also from outside. And sometimes that's in the form of a library. So of course there's, subscriptions to LinkedIn Learning, Pluralsight, etc. But we're seeing companies like Salesforce, for example, bringing in and I mentioned this earlier, their expertise from vendors. So they basically work with training companies that provide that training. And so what this does for them is it gets them 80% there. It gets them to where people get the basic knowledge sorted out, and then they can focus on what's the delta between how quote unquote vanilla things are done versus how it's done at Salesforce. So for example, they were just speaking about this at Technicon when it comes to AWS or how they use Docker, things like that. There's sort of like, there's the standard AWS, but then there's the components they use and the components that they don't use out of that. So they use the external training to get people most of the way there and then deal with the delta. Another example of external knowledge is Essence. So much smaller company. So there were a couple of hundred people out of Montreal, and they, in addition to their peer learning, they wanted to enable their people to go to conferences for a couple of reasons. So for one, they wanted, that was a little perk, right? So going to conferences was a big deal for engineers. But there was also a caveat of bringing that knowledge back. So if you went to a conference, you had to do an internal talk on what you learned externally. So that's kind of how they managed it. And also what was important to Essence was creating their recruiting brand. So by going to conferences, not only to participate, but to speak, that was actually putting them on a map as a place a great place to work at for engineers, especially out in Montreal. So that was their approach. So after implementing all these various components, right? So from onboarding to tech docs to mentorship, coaching, office hours, etc. How do you know how well it's working, right? And so this question always comes up, the question of measuring success, and it's a tough one. It's not straightforward to measure it. There are different ways to kind of think about that. So when it comes to learning, there's the Kirkpatrick scale. So it's got level 1 through 4. Level 1 is, happy, sad, how much you like something, all the way to level 4, which is what was the impact of that learning to the business. And the challenges is that level 3 and 4, impact to business and impact to self, are somewhat harder to measure. And those are the ones that are actually important. So that's a challenge there. We have a way to reason about it, but we don't have an accurate way to measure it. For leadership, in my experiences, even though leadership says, hey, we're data driven, it's usually based on stories. So if they hear a squeaky wheel, they'll sort of latch onto that, and so there's that. Pulse surveys, things of that nature, tend to kind of highlight those stories and bring it up to the leadership level, and that illustrates what's working or what's not working usually. When it comes to onboarding, we usually think about how long it takes somebody to get productive. So from entering the company to, for example, shipping a feature, or sometimes it's the 10th feature or commit. So that there's a little bit of a normalization there. So that's one way. So basically, it's all about kind of compressing that time frame so that we can get people up and running quicker. When it comes to culture, success is usually measured to attrition. So are people staying, or retention more specifically, are people staying in a company, or what is the attrition level, and can we manage that and lower it? So that's usually how that's looked at. For recruiting, I mentioned the brand. This is becoming more and more important as the talent pool is becoming harder and harder to basically deal with. So it's becoming very competitive out there, and companies that are known as great companies to work at have better luck with that. So being out there, for example, at conferences, etc., or being known as a place that has a deliberate way to grow engineers to enable people to do their best work, tends to attract great people. So. But the takeaway is that there is no silver bullet for measuring success. There's just this different ways to do that, and they produce different results for different audiences or situations. So a couple of, I mentioned Microsoft. This is a talk that they did at Technicon when we were in person, and they were talking about how they measure their success. And the takeaway is that it's very scientific at Microsoft, partially because they have a lot of data, partially because they have so many engineers, like I mentioned, 100,000 plus at this point. So it's totally one extreme. LinkedIn uses feedback and metrics to kind of track that. So Rajan has been a big proponent of this question of how do we track and how do we measure success, and what does that Kirkpatrick level 3 and 4 look like? The impact of learning to self and to the business. And so this is the case where he was evaluating that and reflecting on how to approach it. So some general trends that we're observing. Pandemic changed things. So remote first is not just moving to Zoom. There's as we mentioned earlier, there's different tools, different approaches, it's a ball game altogether, being remote first when it comes to knowledge sharing and technical enablement in general. One of the things that we're seeing is that the blended approach is probably the most effective. So whereas in the past we would see companies that are either biasing in-person instructor-led training or purely documentation, we're now seeing that it's actually a blend of the two. And so different modalities for different purposes work usually the best. And another thing, and maybe we're slightly biased here, but it appears that tech enablement is becoming a thing. We're seeing more and more job postings for VP of tech enablement managers, etc. It's usually called something else, so the naming is still not. We're not set on that as the industry, but it's being funded, and people are paying attention to that. So those are some general trends that we're observing. So with that, questions, comments, thoughts. So there's a question from Holly. Do you see tech enablement typically embedded in tech or within HR, or a combination of both? That's a great question. So we see it in both. And I would say there's a trend of moving from HR to Eng. In general. So it usually started by HR owning it all, and then HR noticing that they're not technical enough, to HR dedicating a person on the HR team to own it, to that person now becoming a part of engineering organization. So we've seen sort of this path. It could also be due to the maturity of the organization, right? So smaller company may not be able to have somebody fully dedicated to tech enablement, so it may fall onto HR, but that usually means that it's not being done, right? So HR usually just handles the sort of your HR-ish onboarding, and then it goes to the manager, and so that usually means that then you're skipping that organizational level, and the end result of that is that you have every manager on their own, every team on their own. And so there's lack of you get silos basically of knowledge and understanding. And so in the long run, that's not very conducive to innovation, to being nimble, etc. All right, well, thank you then. And I know we referenced a lot of stories. So this is all in the deck. So I'll be following up with you, and I'll send you the deck with the links to these various stories. So you can, if anything was inspirational, you can find out more from those companies that actually did that. So yeah, thank you all.